Before we begin, just a quick content warning. This episode will feature discussions of racism and xenophobia. This episode also features strong language, including the repetition of racial slurs.
For most of my life, from childhood, from that early experience of being spat at and abused and physically attacked in the 60s at my local team, it was the general sentiment of the audience. I didn't have to read a room to know that I was unwelcome.
Went to the Baggies, watched the games, but ended up being not just verbally abused, but actually chased home. And I know every yard of the journey back from Smethwick, from the Albion ground. I gave it a couple of attempts. It didn't get any better. I didn't feel safe. And then for a short period, obviously gave up the notion that attending football was for me.
Birmingham has been in the news lately, and for all the wrong reasons. From MPs declaring Birmingham's diverse neighbourhoods to be slums devoid of white faces, to balaclavaed men putting up St. George's flags across the city. And from anti-immigrant protests outside asylum hotels to the controversy surrounding the banning of Maccabi Tel Aviv fans by the West Midlands Police. Things in Brum have been tense, to say the least. All of this brings back memories of racial tensions in Birmingham's not-so-distant past. And yet, Birmingham remains one of the most vibrant cities in the UK, with a vast cultural legacy that continues to shape its citizens today. It's the city of Benjamin Zephaniah and the Bull Ring, of Pigeon Park and the Peaky Blinders, of Jack Grealish and Jude Bellingham. Birmingham is also home to three of the oldest football teams in the country. Aston Villa and Birmingham City both turned 150 recently, and West Bromwich Albion will follow suit in 3 years' time. Birmingham's history of immigration is even older than its football teams, and the stands at Villa Park, St Andrews, and the Hawthorns are amongst some of the most diverse in the country. So let's dive into the intersection of ethnic diversity and football in Birmingham and unpack some of the history behind the rising tensions we have seen in the city of late. I'm Hijab Shah, host of Being Brummie, a 3-part podcast documentary series that explores football and race relations in the Second City. This is episode 1, Revisiting the Past. You might be wondering, what does this American-sounding woman know about Birmingham? Even though I sound like a Yank, I am a Brummie by birth. I was born in Queen Elizabeth Hospital, like so many of my fellow Brummies, but I sound like this because I spent 30-plus years outside of the UK, moving back only in 2022. I am Pakistani by origin, and my parents lived in Birmingham and eventually decided to leave Birmingham in the 80s. A decade that many of us know to be synonymous with both football hooliganism, but also racial tensions. I am keen to explore the intersection of race and football in the place I was born, not just because of my personal history, but also because of my doctoral research. I'm a PhD student studying the role of football in radicalization and counter-radicalization at the University of St Andrews, which is ironic because even though my alma mater shares its name with the Birmingham City Football Stadium, I am an Aston Villa fan. Although my parents made the decision to leave Birmingham in the 80s, there are hundreds of thousands of immigrant families who have made Birmingham their home over the years. I wanted to learn more about Birmingham's history of immigration, of the different communities that make up this beautiful, quirky city. Luckily, I was introduced to Dr. Chinn, a beloved Birmingham historian with an MBE, with Aston Villa season tickets, and, as you'll soon hear, with the best Brummie accent ever. Carl very generously gave me a history lesson on how Birmingham came to be a city of immigrants. So let's start with the arrival of the Irish community to Birmingham in the 1820s, 50 years before our football teams came into being.
But it's not really until the 1820s, before the Great Hunger, before the Irish famine, that the Irish started to arrive in Birmingham. There was a collapse in the economy in rural Ireland because of British imperialism, and many people coming over before the famine. Birmingham's Irish population was significant, but it was never more than about 5% Irish born in the total population. Now, of course, we can expand that if we include sons and daughters and those who see themselves as Irish heritage. But by the 1870s, the Irish migration to Birmingham, which had increased following the Great Famine, the terrible Great Hunger, the Irish migration to Birmingham dropped drastically. Why? It continued to Liverpool, Glasgow and London. But overall, the Irish, who can just about afford it, are going to America. They're going to the land of the free, not to the land of the oppressor. So Birmingham's Irish-born population dropped drastically in the late 19th century. But again, they were a very small community. So Birmingham remained an overwhelmingly English city.
This remained the case until Britain was on the brink of World War II. Birmingham was at the forefront of the war effort and saw the return of Irish migrants to help with that effort.
At the end of the 1930s, more Irish people start to come to Birmingham. Birmingham's expanding its industries, the country's rearming. Birmingham's a major centre of ammunition production. A lot of Irish men and women come to work in the factories, but also Irish men to join up and to fight against fascism and Nazism. A lot of Irish women came over as nurses. Other Birmingham employers also recruited Irish women to come over.
History books tend to leave out the significant role played by not just the Irish, but also the denizens of Britain's farther former colonies as well. The Indian subcontinent and the West Indies were critical to Britain's survival in the Second World War. Carl speaks in detail of how this translated into Birmingham's immigration patterns during and after the war.
The change begins in the late 1930s, and one of the first groups to start to settle in Birmingham from outside the British and Irish Isles and outside Europe were the Yemenis. They were Lashkars, merchant seamen. And there's an interesting comparison here with the first Kashmiris, the first Siletis, many of whom were also Lashkars in the Second World War. And they settled around Edward Road in Borsall Heath. And the first prayer house was in Edward Road before ever there was a mosque, and it was through the Yemenis. Towards the end of the Second World War, what we start to see then is a beginning to see a shift in the demography of Birmingham. Nothing huge at the moment, but within 20 years, the demographic change will have really speeded up. Before the Windrush, a few African Caribbean men had also settled in Birmingham. These were overwhelmingly men who had been fighting for Britain and in the RAF. The RAF recruited 5,000 men from the West Indian Islands. Now, obviously, that increased after Windrush, but the beginnings of what was then termed West Indian immigration to Birmingham really can be seen just after the First World War. So we need to understand that the first men from the West Indies had fought for this country. They did not see themselves as foreigners. They were coming home to the mother country. Quickly, the West Indian men were followed by young West Indian women. And that marks a difference with the beginnings of the African Caribbean migration to that of the South Asian migration.
The earliest South Asian families that settled in Birmingham would have arrived around 1947, which is when British colonial rule came to an end and an independent India and Pakistan came into being.
Sikhs start to arrive, and Hindus from the late 40s. Again, these are men mostly who fought in the Indian Army alongside the British, holding back the Japanese at the terrible battles of Kohima and in Imphal. I interviewed an old Sikh man many years ago on my radio show who said, Carl, it was horrendous. We were fighting hand to hand with our bayonets trying to kill them. So we must understand that these men saw themselves as part of the British entity. Because of discrimination, they couldn't get good work. So most of these men went to work in foundries. Dirty, hard, hot. But they were very hard working. Altogether, the Sikh men, Hindu men, the Irish men and women are helping to rebuild a bomb-ravaged Birmingham. People don't realise Birmingham was the second most heavily bombed city in the country after London.
As the post-war immigrant communities settled into life in Birmingham, the pattern of immigration began to change in the 50s and 60s. This coincided with the Windrush years. And as immigration from the Caribbean increased, so did immigration from South Asia.
Men from what is now Bangladesh, but particularly from Pakistan, start to arrive as well. They're from Azad Kashmir. That increases in the later 50s and 1960s, mainly from Mirpur. The Mangla Dam was a big project. The British were involved, and a lot of, in return, there was an agreement, I think, for men from there to be able to come to Birmingham, Bradford, High Wycombe, places like that. So there's a real change. And as the 60s go on and into the early 70s, I think because of immigration acts, certainly by the 70s, a lot more of the families are coming to Birmingham. Men and women who had belonged to what we might call, not just the Raj, but the British polity, the wider idea of Britain.
Learning about the communities that have survived and thrived in Birmingham was incredible. The conversation with Carl got me thinking. So much of the immigrant experience, particularly the post-war arrivals, is within living memory for our neighbors and friends and loved ones. To think of what they lived through, how they uprooted their lives, came to help rebuild a land where they may not have spoken the language and may not have been particularly welcomed, but persevered nonetheless, how they made Birmingham their home. It's truly remarkable. I was recently at Villa Park watching the team take on Bologna in the Europa League. I was pleasantly surprised to be seated close to a group of jovial Sikh uncles, shouting their encouragement at Ollie Watkins in the Brummie accent I know and love so much. At halftime, I realized they were seated beneath the flag, identifying them as part of the Punjabi Villains supporters group. The Punjabi Villains very kindly connected me with one of their members, Amarjit Basi, a longtime villain and the executive director of the Black Leadership Group, an organization that seeks to tackle systemic racism in further education. Amarjit's stories of growing up in Smethwick, on the border with Birmingham, were both entertaining and harrowing. Amarjit and I actually started our conversation talking about Frank Skinner, a comedian who also grew up in Smethwick around the same time, and whose biography, coincidentally, Amarjit happened to be reading at the time. Amarjit saw parallels between his own family life and that of Frank Skinner's.
His father, around the same time, also worked in the foundries that my dad worked in. Basically, some of the working class rituals of Dad and our family and Frank Skinner's family were more or less identical. They worked shift systems, 6 days a week. They clocked off at lunchtime on a Saturday. They ended up drinking at local pubs, their locals. The only difference was at that time, Frank Skinner's father, following the pub, would go and watch football, and Dad would come home and we'd all watch wrestling on the television. But because we were brought up in multicultural Smethwick, my school friends were Black Caribbean, Muslim, white working class. My first football matches, which were in the early 70s, were inevitably at West Bromwich Albion. My first experiences of going to the Hawthorns with my friends were really, really distressing, if I'm perfectly honest. They coincided with racism. Went to the baggies, watched the games, but ended up being not just verbally abused, but actually chased home, and I know every yard of the journey back from Smethwick, from the Albion ground, because I went to a game against Liverpool, a night game, and despite it being a fantastic, sort of experience, and my friends, even had me have West Bromwich Albion scarves wrapped around my wrists. So if you look at the fashion of wearing scarves at the time, people wore them on their wrists, and I was told to take off that scarf, but also chased home. And it's important to say my close school friends were devastated. They were absolutely shocked, devastated by that. I gave it a couple of attempts. It didn't get any better. I didn't feel safe. And then for a short period, obviously gave up the notion that attending football was for me. And it's ironic now, if you look at the Albion support, including its season tickets. Some of my closest cousins are now season ticket holders at West Bromwich Albion. So clearly it was a sign and a reflection of that era, politics and so on, whatever.
One of Amarjit's cousins in question, Bhopinder Basi, had similarly harrowing brushes with racism and violence in his early years at West Brom. When Bhopinder and I chatted, I was struck by his reflections on his youth, where he was deeply involved in activism around the times of the Black and Asian youth movements. Although he is an avid West Brom supporter now, for years Bhopinder shunned the Baggies because of his childhood experiences and on principle as a young activist. He tells the story of how he chose to support an out-of-town team instead of the Baggies.
For most of my life, from childhood, from that early experience of being spat at and abused and physically attacked in the 60s, my local team, it was the general sentiment of the audience. I didn't have to read a room to know that I was unwelcome, right? So what happened after that? I, for 30-odd years, went to Old Trafford regularly, and I was a Man United fan. When my 25-year-old daughter was born, it dawned on me that I'd spent a lot of money for Man United and I loved them with a passion. And because I have an intellectual bent, I decided to reflect and try and understand why so many of my generation, born in the 60s and 70s, to parents of people from the Indian subcontinent, who were mainly boys who were rabid football fans, supported either Liverpool or Manchester United. And nothing sickened me more to find that their grandchildren and often their children also supported those clubs, even though they had no geographic connection to Manchester or Liverpool. When I started supporting Manchester United at about the age of 10, so it would have been 1970, by then they'd won the European Cup. And if I had to have a club, would I rather the fantasy that somewhere football will accept me, or would I want to walk up the road and become a baggy, which might have been my birthright, but was being denied?
The sad thing is, both Bhopinder and Amarjit had just missed out on a massive positive change in West Bromwich Albion's squad, which subsequently transformed its fan base as well. In the late 70s, several years after both cousins had already chosen to support other teams, the Baggies became the first team in the English top flight to have 3 black footballers consistently on the pitch. Laurie Cunningham, Brendan Batson, and Cyril Regis changed the face of English football forever. The 3 degrees, as they were nicknamed, paved the way for future generations of black players in the sport, and for black and brown fans who finally saw themselves represented on the pitch. However, both Bhopinder and Amarjit had already been scarred by their experiences in and around the Hawthorns, and while Bhopinder chose the fantasy of a distant Manchester United, Amarjit honed in a little closer to home. Here's Amarjit again.
Recognizing that West Bromwich Albion wasn't for me, another school friend asked me to give Villa a go. I remember vividly that meant twice the length of journey compared with going to the Albion. It was taking the 87 bus to Summerfield Park, and then you took the Outer Circle bus, the number 11, to Witton at Villa Park. The cheapest part of the stadium stand wasn't the Holt end, it was the old uncovered Witton end, which is now the North Stand. And the princely cost of going into the ground plus the bus fare return was 12 pence at the time. I didn't go to all the games, but the feeling was different. There was some element that here's a club steeped in history, maybe because they were in the doldrums. There was a feeling that you are welcome, and it felt natural to be there. I genuinely, hand on heart, say I did not experience and encounter racism at that time, and I'm not being romantic about that. And these were magical times for me. We'd go and stand on the Holt End 2 hours before kickoff. Not like now where you just, you can arrive just in time. And the camaraderie of standing on the terraces and the top end of the most vocal and vibrant and fervent support, overwhelmingly white people. I never felt anything other than supported. Maybe a key part of that was my immediate friends and fellow supporters were white, and therefore I was included.
Hearing Amarjit describe his positive experiences at the Holt End was a little bit surprising, particularly because it definitely differed from the experiences of another longtime villain that I spoke to. Ray Walters started attending matches at Villa Park in the 70s, just like Amarjit. Ray's love for football extends to his work as well. He leads TSA Projects, a youth-focused sport and education nonprofit. Ray is of Afro-Caribbean descent and recalls the experience of being a young black villain back in the day.
As I grew up, we started sneaking into the ground, watching the games, and then it just sort of went from there. Became a fan, got addicted to the atmosphere, the crowds, the noise. So I can recall being at the Villa ground. I can't remember who they were playing. I remember the crowd. The Holt End probably held 35,000 people standing. I remember literally the whole crowd. There was a black player playing for the other team, and they were singing "Nigger, nigger, nigger, lick my boots." That was a normal occurrence.
To hear slurs like that at such a young age must have been harrowing for Ray. I asked him what impact that had on him as a kid.
It affected you because as a young black kid of Jamaican parents, you knew it wasn't right, but because so many people were doing it and nobody was saying anything, it was the norm, you just had to kind of accept it. It was just past the era of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So it wasn't many years later than that. But when you're in it, it's, I was excited about it. Couldn't wait for Saturdays to come. Meet up with the lads, go and have a drink, go to the game.
We talked a bit about fan clashes resulting from racism on and off the pitch. There's so much I've heard over the years about football violence and how intense it can be, but I wanted to understand how racism might have played a role where fans from Birmingham were concerned.
Two of the worst clubs of the racism when I was young was Liverpool and Everton. They were just, they'd see their fans would come and they'd, you're black, CUNT and things like that. They used to chase us. So as we got older, when Liverpool, Everton would come, the local kids would get together, 15, 16, we'd get sticks, we'd get bricks, and if we caught any of them off guard, because we were only young and some of these were men, we'd really give them a bashing, just because when we hear their accents, it's just revenge from stuff that happened 2-3 years ago. We didn't know them from Adam, but, it was retribution for what happened to us there.
In my earlier conversation with Carl Chinn, we spoke about the fan violence of the 70s and 80s. He recalled his own experiences, which are quite similar to what Ray mentioned as well.
Unfortunately, in the 70s, just as football hooliganism had really taken off, a lot of the fans were skinheads or supporters, what we now call the far right. And there was some horrible chants sometimes. Horrible chants. The early 70s, when you went away, it was a battle everywhere. You'd go on a football special and you'd get off, there'd be 300 or 400 of you, and you've got to stick together. If you got split up, you were in trouble. Because in them days, we were all collared up. So we'd have a wool and scarf, carrot and blue. We'd have silk scarf on each wrist, carrot and blue. We'd have badges. No wonder they could tell who we were. And that was the same everywhere. So in that period, you tried to stick together. If you got attacked, if the hard lads at the front stood, you stood. If they turned to run, you run. And any of these so-called hooligans that say their line never broke, everybody's line broke. You ran, especially in the 70s. It was more different, I think, in the 80s because it was more organised. You had proper firms.
Firms, for those of you who may not know the term, describes football fan groups with a hardcore supporter base. As Carl mentioned, the 1980s saw the rise of these firms throughout the country. Organized, intimidating, and deeply anti-authority, football firms developed a reputation for violence and hooliganism. Many hooligan firms also had a reputation for racism, but the firms of Birmingham were a little bit different. Here's Ray again.
And this is where the multicultural firms came into play, because Villa had a firm called the Sea Crew. There was a lot of black guys in that Sea Crew, but there was still a lot of racism in the grounds. One of the firms who really sort of outed it was Birmingham City, because they had a firm called the Zulus.
The Sea Crew and the Zulus weren't the only multicultural firms in the country, but they were probably the most famous. The Zulus, in particular, have come up in my research time and time again. We'll delve into that a little bit more in future episodes. We've heard from Baggies fans and Villa fans, but now it's time to hear from a couple of Birmingham City supporters as well to get their take on things. I spoke with a Blues fan named Martin, whose family has Irish roots and who's been attending matches at St Andrews since the 70s. We sat and chatted outside the Old Crown, which is the oldest pub in Birmingham and a pre-match favourite for many Blue Noses. Martin spoke about Howard Gale, who was one of the first black footballers to play for Birmingham City, just a few years after the Three Degrees had made their mark at West Brom. Gale, who had transferred from Liverpool to Birmingham City in 1983, apparently had very different experiences with the two fan bases.
I remember him saying he played at Liverpool, which was a bigger club than us, and realised even as a black person how racist on the terraces. Never saw any black faces on the terrace. When he come to Birmingham, I remember him saying that we scored once, and he went up, stood on the railings which surrounded the pitch, and saw a lot of black faces and felt more at home in Birmingham than he did ever in Liverpool.
I asked Martin if this had always been the case in his experience, if the stands at St Andrews had always been this diverse.
And of course, as growing up in Birmingham, there was always, in Birmingham City Football Club itself, there's always multi-racial fans. Always, I think, less Asians at the time, I thought, but more West Indian, like African or West Indian. But plenty of, black and white faces. And Birmingham has always been a multiracial, but had its issues as well, hasn't it? My uncles, I had two Irish uncles, one from Northern Ireland, one from Southern Ireland, and they were treated similarly to, black Asian people back then. There was a lot of racism with the older generation, but within the football, that was never. It didn't matter what, where you were from or what, but as long as you were the Blues,
There are, of course, many parallels between the Irish experience with discrimination and the experiences of people of colour, not just in Birmingham, but across the UK. Ray alluded to it earlier, talking about that era of the no Irish, no blacks, no dogs signs. Not to generalize, but my guess is that this shared experience probably contributed to some of the more positive and inclusive stories that you hear from this older generation of Brummie football fans. Another Blues fan of the same generation is named Mickey Singh. Mickey is the founder of the Birmingham City supporters group Blues for All, and is a bit of a legend amongst Blues fans. I really wanted to hear Mickey's story, and was lucky to have a conversation with his son, Big Singh, who co-leads Blues for All with his dad. Big shared stories of his family history of being proud Blue Noses.
So I'm what you probably call third generation Birmingham City fan. My granddad, when he first come to this country, it was in the early 50s, and he settled at Small Heath, right outside St Andrews Road. He actually lived on St Andrews Road. So my dad, including all his siblings, went to the local schools, got to know all the players around that time, around that era, when they were growing up. My father, he probably went to his first game, I believe, when he was 6 or 7 years old. And he's been going ever since, and he's a 70-year-old man now. Season ticket holder. I go to watch games with him now, and my two boys come along and watch the games. You know, we've got a family tradition there. There's a lot of history. You know, it is literally in our DNA.
Big started out talking about his grandfather, who was the first in the family to move to the UK, and the first to start attending matches at Birmingham City.
So I think my granddad, he went to a few games. I think his priorities were different. I mean, he had to teach himself how to speak English. When he moved here, he had to integrate and try and settle in and get to know his neighbours. The club was on our doorstep, so you know he got to know all the locals as well. But I think their priority at the time was more about actually surviving. How are we going to pay the bills? How are we going to pay for things? You know, he was one of those where he worked in a foundry. He also was doing door-to-door sales. So he was always working. So football probably wasn't the priority for him, but he did get the experience and did go to matches. I think with his children, though, it was different because although they were pushed in the direction of, yeah, you do need to work, they just had this love for football. So they made sure that their Saturdays were always free and they were able to travel to like away games too as well. So they had to make their excuses, whereas probably there was more emphasis on when you're old enough, we need to start working and saving up and help pay your sister, you know, pay for your sister's weddings. So you know, large family, lots of siblings. It was you know, work, as Rihanna would say.
Big's dad, Mickey, has a lot in common with Amarjit and Bhopinder, who I spoke with earlier. They're all Punjabi, they're all roughly of the same generation, and they're all massive football fans. Their childhood experiences around football, however, seem to be a little different in comparison. I asked Big if his family had dealt with the same sort of discrimination that Amarjit and Bhopinder's family went through, if race relations ever impacted their relationship with football.
I think it didn't hinder us in the sense that for my family particularly, it's because of where we lived and the location, the network that they built, the friendships they built, the relationships that they built with a lot of the other supporters. I mean, my father had his own challenges of acceptance initially. You know, it was one thing being as a kid and having school friends, but then when they are not your school friends and you're trying to ingratiate yourself within a network and you're not being accepted because of the colour of your skin or what you're wearing a turban. Now, my dad has played football at like Sunday League level. He's managed as well, and he's also refereed. So he's experienced it not just in the stadiums as a fan, but he's also experienced it as a playing side. So I think when you can either turn away. So when you had these challenges and these blockers that come and you had these issues that were going on at that time, there's a lot of people who just turned away then. They decided this isn't for them.
Big is right. I'm sure there are so many people from minoritized backgrounds who've given up on football because of the lack of representation or because they felt unwelcome. Big's dad Mickey overcame a lot, particularly as a visibly Sikh man who wears a turban. But he made sure there was space for him and his family at St Andrew's Stadium.
We lived outside that stadium, so it's not something that passion was always there, and nothing was going to really faze like my dad, his brothers, even to some of my aunties at a young age. They went to a few games, and then after they'd finished their schooling and whatnot, they ended up getting married and then lived outside of Birmingham, but they've still got that affinity and that connection, that love for Birmingham.
Hearing about Big's aunties attending football matches actually really surprised me. Brown women and girls in football stadiums aren't even that common today, let alone back then. That's not to say that women were absent from stadiums altogether. Carl, who we heard from earlier, shares a story about the women in his own family at Villa Park.
They talk about women in football today. They were never there. I always go down the match with women. I was 9 when I went the first match. We lost 6-2 at home. I was taken by our nan and our mum. The first fight I saw, proper fight, was my nan at the Holt end. 4'11.5" of fighting Aston. An away fan nicked our kid's hat, threw it on the floor because we stood together then, spat on it and tried to hit an iron hand, turned round, swore and hit him with the right hook. And it was a big one because she'd lost a finger, a right forefinger in a power press accident. So she had a big knuckle, and when I hit you, oh.
This got me thinking about my own experiences at football matches. Not the punching someone part, but the fact that even in Birmingham, I'll often find that I'm one of maybe a handful of black or brown women in my stand. I wonder why that is, why more women of ethnic minority backgrounds don't attend football matches. I spoke about this with Nilesh Chauhan, manager of the Fans for Diversity campaign and co-founder of the Villains Together supporters group.
My mum, she's never been to a game before because she still thinks there's no seats at a game. Because when she sees it on TV, she just sees all these bunch of people in a stand and she gets like, oh no, I can't do that. You know, it's just, I don't know, I think I'd get lost and I don't know which way to go. She has this perception. I'm still trying to convince her to go. I said, I'll go with her. She's still like, I'm not sure. But it's that kind of perception. And obviously you see things on TV and then in the violence and sometimes when the fans run onto the pitch and when your parents see that and when they've come from a foreign country and they come into this country and they see that and they think, well, there's not a chance I'm letting my son or daughter go there. Especially my son or daughter being South Asian, they think they're already a target. So they don't want an excuse for them to be an even bigger target to hit.
We'll hear a bit more from Nilesh in later episodes, but I wanted to highlight this theme of fear that carries through generations of immigrants, rooted in the experiences of the past. Here's Bick again.
Even now, if you speak to South Asian people now who've never been to football, they will still link to the 70s and the skinheads and just, all the racism, that was around, and with the hooliganism that it turns people away. The thing is now we're trying to, as a community, as a South Asian community, especially how deeply involved we are with football, we're trying to give those people an access point so they can feel comfortable to come to games. There's a lot of misconceptions and they're based on what they've seen on TV and what they'd experienced in the past.
Hearing the stories of this older generation of black and brown Brummies and understanding their complicated relationships with football has been incredibly enlightening. Things have changed since these trailblazers first fought to make space for themselves in the terraces of the Hawthorns, Villa Park, and St. Andrews. It's because of this generation that we now have more black and brown people in the stands and on the pitch. Work still remains to be done, but despite the efforts of those who want to sow divisions, immigrants are inextricably woven into Birmingham's fabric, on and off the pitch. I want to end on this note from Bhopinder, who talks about his children's generation and their relationship with football.
My daughters were brought up loving football and so on. Anyway, when I had this revelation, I was in my mid-30s. That actually, all these years, part of denying my own birthright had made me a Man United fan. You know what I did? I owned lots of Manchester United paraphernalia that I picked up over the years, packed it all up and gave it to a homeless person. This homeless person did support Man United and he was moving into a hostel. And he shared this with me. I said, look, believe it or not, I've got all this United gear that I need to get rid of in order so that my 25-year-old will never be a Man United fan. So my daughters were brought up to be Baggies fans. And I'd always said to both of them, it's a birthright. You may not like football, but your birthright. You can support the Baggies.
Listening to Bhopinder speak about his daughter is quite emotional. The choice of that word, Birthright is so poignant, especially at a time when aspersions are being cast on the Britishness of people who look like Bhopinder's daughter. People who look like me. As we see the rise of racial tensions today, there are parallels with the experiences of the past, not just in Birmingham, but throughout the country. And we see that creep into football as well. We'll delve deeper into those parallels in our next episode, where we'll be back with more football-loving Brummies and a few non-Brummies as well. Until then, as they say in Birmingham, ta-ra a bit, bab! A big thank you to Carl Chinn, Amarjit Basi, Bhopinder Basi, Ray Walters, Big Singh, Nilesh Chauhan, and our friend Martin for being so generous with their time. As a reminder, the opinions shared in the interviews are those of the interviewees alone. Thank you to the School of IR EDI Committee at the University of St Andrews for the funding that has made this podcast documentary possible. Thank you to Stephen Underwood for our logo and graphics, and to Matt Summers for our music. A massive shout out to our editor, Numair Habib, for putting this podcast together. And finally, many thanks to all of you for listening.